morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm George Yednek with Senior Housing News, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. The subject of today's webinar is Benchmarking Senior Living Operations, sponsored by Dude Solutions. Now, a few housekeeping items before we get started. All phone lines have been muted for sound quality purposes. We also encourage you to ask and participate in the webinar today by asking questions using the question section of the GoToWebinar platform located in the lower right-hand side of the screen. We will do our best to answer any and all questions that come in during the webinar at the end of the session. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be sent out via email from Dude Solutions as a follow-up to today's webinar. So please keep an eye out in your email box over the next 48 hours with instructions on how to download the slide deck and review the recording. So last but not least, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Josh Malbogat with Dude Solutions. He is the Director of Senior Living. And Josh, at this point, I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, George. I'm really happy to be speaking to everyone today about something that we here at Dude Solutions are really passionate about, senior living operations. Joining me is Lindsay Farwick. She's our Senior Living Client Success Manager. She works with a lot of our communities, the clients that we work with, and is going to be sharing some of their specific stories as we go through this presentation. So from an agenda perspective, let me just get right there. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background to kick off on where we're going to be pulling the benchmarks we're going to share with you today from, and then we're going to dive into them. We've chosen to break them out relative to a couple of key areas: preventative maintenance, compliance, productivity, outsourcing and staffing levels, resident satisfaction and service, and communication. But all of this will be centered around the operations or facility side of senior living. And as we go through this, we're going to share notes from the field, if you will, examples and stories of how communities have applied these and used them. And that'll be both Lindsay and I sharing those stories. So the data that we're going to be looking at today, where does it come from? So basically, this is something that we, as I said, are really passionate about. Dude Nation, if you will, is, well, our company and all of our clients. So we have about 11,000 clients across, well, the world. 1,000 plus of them are senior living focused. That's really been what I've focused the last 18 years on. And we've been collecting data with these senior living communities over 18 years. We've tracked 3 million labor hours. We've got about $1.5 billion worth of assets tracked. We're tracking 1.2 million work orders a month. We've got almost 250,000 users logging in. We're taking all of the data that these folks are putting in and then synthesizing it and creating benchmarks. In addition to that, we also wanted to look outside of ourselves. So we created a survey that we completed. We'll be doing this annually. It was just a couple months ago. Hoping to get more and more folks involved. The communities that we surveyed in terms of responses, about half of them were life plan or CCRCs. And then you've got a mix of skilled nursing, assisted living, independent living, and others with a mix. So the data that you see today will be an amalgam of both benchmarks we've collected when we've anonymized our live client data, as well as surveys that we've pulled from non-clients to get a broader picture. The respondents from the survey perspective, about 10% were executive, 5% corporate facilities folks. Large percentage were directors and managers directly on the facilities side. So we'll see a strong preference in terms of the type of responses towards those roles. And then others, about 20% coordinators, administrators, analysts, those types of positions. In terms of the size of communities that were responding, about 20% were under 200 units. Fair number, about 43% fell between the 200 and 400 unit range. So we do see in some of the staffing metrics that we'll share and things like that, data that is slightly tilted towards larger organizations. So what are we actually going to see when we get into this? So what we've pulled together are the survey results from our operations survey, that benchmarking data. We're going to pull out some of our interpretation of what the data means. And then, as I said earlier, some of the client stories, so you get a feel for how this actually applies. My hope is that through this, you'll get some stories that you can share with others in your organization, ways to look at how you're tracking data or how you're not, and what that might mean, why something might be important to look at, and what you might want to do in terms of getting others in the organization on side to track something like productivity or number of work orders or resident satisfaction, all kinds of things that we'll touch on. So first topic will be preventative maintenance. Now, I'm sure many of us know, preventative maintenance as a thing. It's recurring scheduled maintenance tasks that we do. Really, we want to look at this from the perspective of, maximizing asset lifespan, really deferring capital expenditures. So when we buy a piece of equipment, making sure that we get the most out of it that we can, so we're not spending more money than we have to. Looking at, reducing the number of emergency repairs to lower our operational costs, lowering the number of emergencies that come up, being more planned in the work, actually has a direct impact on the productivity of our facilities teams. Looking at how this can impact resident service, and finally, lower energy costs as we actually take care of the equipment. So all of those are key things. Just one kind of visual for you. This actually is something we pulled from one of the organizations we worked with. They had a new plant director come in, and he, found out quite quickly that the previous gentleman had not been following through on the planned maintenance program. This is just an example of a filter that hadn't been changed. This was an interesting one because it actually brought for me to light the direct connection between PM and the health of the residents. They had in this community a very high instance of respiratory issues. Turned out it was because they hadn't been doing their filter changes. It was just nasty air flowing through. So what we looked at here from our survey was the percent of work within a community that was preventative maintenance. So if you took all the work that people were doing, all their work orders, and then said, what percent of that is preventative maintenance? And this was from our survey results. So it was people self-reporting data. It was pretty interesting because you can see basically almost 26% of the sites were reporting between 40 and 60% of their work was planned. So if we think about that, that means that, all of the resident requests, the staff requests, the painting things that have to happen, too hot, too cold issues, all of those were making up only between 40 and 60%. The rest of it was preventative maintenance. What's interesting here is that when we actually looked at actual client data, it told a different story. Average was actually closer to about 35%. And I think that this was symptomatic of people overestimating how much they're actually following through on their PM plans. We've worked with a lot of groups where they have PM plans in place, and the expectation is that folks will follow through. Unfortunately, due to a variety of factors, things kind of can fall apart on the front line. So what we found was, in reality, about 35% was the average percent of work that was PM, but that is higher than we saw it in the last 2 or 3 years. It's been creeping up every year. More and more attention is being focused on PM. I don't think that we'll ever really hit, some of the lofty goals that they have in other industries like manufacturing or areas like that, where they try to target 80 to 90%. I simply think that's not realistic within the senior living context. But certainly getting above 35% into that 50% range is something that I have seen organizations hit, and I've seen them have great benefit from it for those reasons that I listed off previously. Things like extending asset life, paying less on energy because the equipment is operating properly, lowering the number of emergencies and the costs associated with those. So lots of value there. Now, in terms of kind of trends that we see relative to the idea of preventative maintenance, Lindsay, I think that when we were talking about this, you had talked about the idea of communities starting to recognize, related to PM, the value of tribal knowledge and things like that. Could you share with us kind of what you've been hearing there?
Yeah, definitely. Tribal knowledge is something that, is definitely talked about a lot. I don't know that everybody refers to it necessarily that way, but the idea that there is that aging workforce, and the necessity to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks. So, developing a plan, putting that plan in a CMMS platform so that we're minimizing missing those key tasks, right, that have the benefits that you mentioned before, so that we're not impacting our residents unnecessarily, our equipment is running efficiently, and ultimately our capital plan is also hopefully up to date too.
We've certainly seen a lot of issues around people building up PM systems, but they're all in their head. And then when that person departs, the organization has nothing. They're left trying to piece it together. We've had examples of folks who have had fantastic programs, buildings look great, facilities director, moves on to another opportunity or retires, and the administrator is left kind of holding the bag, not really sure what to do because nothing was documented. I had one group that I worked with years ago where they actually tracked the facilities director had built the PM program on the back of cigarette packs that had calendars. He'd circled all the dates on them, had beautiful kind of documentation on everything. Well, he took that with him when he left. On purpose or not, I don't know, but the organization did not have anything left to go on, so quite a challenge. We've also seen groups where the corporate level creates a PM plan, hands it off to site level folks, and they then choose what parts to execute. I worked with a group where they had about a 50-page PM binder, sat with the facilities person at their lead site, translating it into our system, and about 40–50% of the jobs that were outlined, he would say, no, we don't do that, or we don't do it that way. And we'd skip the page. And that was, quite an eye-opener for the COO in that case. So with PM, we think there's a huge obligation to both create a system to maintain that tribal knowledge, as Lindsay was talking about, and actually monitor it and be able to track it. So related to preventative maintenance, compliance. Of course, this is a major thing for all of us. I really believe regardless of care level, if we're on the skilled side, yes, there's a much higher level, but all the way through fire code, things like that, there are things that we need to take care of, both from a requirement perspective to show that we've got everything documented, but also from a safety perspective. I mean, a lot of these things are there, as frustrating as they may be, for reasons. NFPA is built on, solving actual problems that have happened. That's why a lot of the code exists. So it does come in different types. You've got the NFPA, Life Safety Code, OSHA, you might have local regulations. Adding to that is the challenge that you get different inspectors. You got the fire marshal who might come in, you got building inspectors, you've got state level, then sometimes the federal look behind surveys. It can be really challenging to manage all of these people, especially when they interpret the code differently. It requires a lot of work. We have to know what to do. We have to have the reminders. We have to document it. I'm sure that for everybody on this call, you're probably well familiar with this. Anyone in senior living has been through one of these reviews. It can be really frustrating. So what we looked at here was, what was the most challenging thing for folks when it comes to compliance? We found that, the top ones, number of 41%, keeping up with the changes. That was a major one. And we hear that on an ongoing basis, knowing what I have to do, when I have to do it. And a close second, well, relatively second, 21%, was setting up the processes. Now, normally these two are more in line, but I think the timing of when we did the survey with the new regs coming out on the skilled side, up that keeping up with changes. People staying on top of things like the new fire door regs was really a challenge. Just figuring out how is it I'm supposed to, determine whether someone is properly trained on doing a fire door inspection. What is the requirement on that? So we did see that this was something that was definitely a large concern for folks. We also did a brief study in-house just looking at citation data from the last, I believe it was 12 months. So what this is showing, and again, we're going to be sending this presentation out afterwards, so don't worry about writing these numbers down if you're interested in them. They'll be in there. This is looking at where the citations were most prevalent. So of organizations that were cited for a KTAG, a fire safety deficiency, 50% were being hit with sprinkler system related citations, 48% electrical wiring. And we chose to focus here on fire safety. No, we're not doing the full piece. We're looking just at the facility side. What I found was really interesting in talking to folks about these, as we kind of dug into data, was the idea of where is it that people run into the challenges? And a lot of the time, we found people were doing the work, but not necessarily documenting things the way that they needed to. Or they would miss one of the required inspections. Maybe they didn't have a reminder system, or maybe they just had something happen. So the importance of building out reminders for yourself to know when you have to do this and properly documenting it really shone through on this for us. Another one that we've started to hear more about, Lindsay, I think you've gotten more feedback on this, Legionella and some of the kind of compliance things related to that and the risk associated with that.
Yeah, definitely. We have a large chain that we've worked with to better understand what that looks like for them and what's required as part of that. And so they've been able to use our CMMS platform to build out PMs and inspecting unoccupied areas so that they make sure there isn't standing water, right? Because that's a huge issue that they face in especially unoccupied apartments. They have to flush the toilets, they have to run the faucets. All of that, keeping in mind, right, that we're trying to minimize the likelihood and impact of those citations because they are very costly. They were talking about, the staggering amounts that they could pay if they were cited for a Legionella issue. So definitely brought it home for sure.
Yeah, and what I think is really interesting about that, this was another education moment for me. I had never even thought about the idea of, in this community or organization, snowbirds, and the fact that their units would be vacant for a fair amount of time, and them having to actually go in and inspect for standing water and document where is it that they might have these issues, right. Things that I wasn't even really thought about 5-10 years ago. Another one we've heard a lot about, I think I mentioned this earlier, was the fire door inspections. Lots of challenges there for folks. Big lesson I had in this was document a list of what your fire doors are and be accurate. I worked with one group where they erred, I guess, in documenting every door in the building, and then got into a whole debate because they didn't have inspection records for every door, but were trying to make the case that not every door was a fire door, but someone had accidentally put the fact that they were on the form. So there were all these questions around that, and it was just a real hassle for them. So we do see that, the need for the reminders, the documentation, and the procedures and reminders for things like what are the Legionella inspections we're going to be doing really matter. And it goes back to the idea of that tribal knowledge or corporate history. Having that documented was another thing we heard was really essential because that then creates a system that lasts for you, whether that's in a CMS or in an Excel sheet. Just have something there to pass on and to give you control over it. So the next topic that we looked at was productivity. So this is always a sensitive one, I think, when I talk to facilities directors and even administrators or executive directors, because people get worried about, I think, Big Brother counting how many hours they have, where time goes, all those types of things. So in this, the way that I look at this is we're never going to expect an 8-hour day from someone. Aside from just breaks, breaks and lunches, automatically that takes you out below 8. But you've also got meetings, you've got training, travel, coordinating with contractors, all the other things. Does the facilities folks go and deliver packages for people or accept inventory? There's all kinds of things that pull away from what I would call, or we would call, actual wrench time. So what we were trying to pull out here was, how much wrench time do we actually expect and get from our operations, our facilities folks? And our goal with this was to start to look at what do we think that we can kind of set as the expectation to make it easier to identify who our stars and who our opportunities for coaching might be, and by actually tracking the time that someone's working and then benchmarking that, we've got that ability. So in terms of the results, you've got this kind of mapped out here. Large, almost 50% of people were reporting between 6 and 7 hours. I find from having audited actual data, so when I was talking about us tracking 1.2 million work orders per month, if I isolate that to folks that are tracking time and then drill in and remove some of the fluff stuff, we find that the reality is actually closer to about 4.5 to 5.5 hours of productive maintenance time. And there's lots of reasons, as I was saying, for why that gets pulled out. But what we do find is that organizations that track time have a higher number of productive work hours per staff member. And it's not just that they have a higher number of hours, because that could be influenced by the staff members just over-reporting. We also find that there's things like faster response times because they're getting to more work. So it does become something that has a wider impact than just logging time. So we did take this data and then correlate it to the correlate the productivity that they reported to the person's title. So in our survey, we were actually asking people to report whether they were a technician or executive or manager, that type of thing. So what was interesting here was 100% of technicians and executives reported in that 6 to 7 hour range. 23% of managers reported 7+ days, and 33% of managers reported under 6 hours a day. I tried to draw, direct conclusions from this. I think that what I pulled out was that I think that I think that a number of people took an 8-hour day, less a lunch and some breaks, and just gave us, 6 to 7 hours. Again, based on the data that we actually have, it's a little different. So related to that, I wanted to share a couple of stats from those millions of work orders that I was talking about that give an idea on productivity for yourself, something that you can think about. So number one, average time per job. If I assemble all the work orders where time was tracked, and I'm not breaking things down by type or anything like that here, it's 1 hour and 10 minutes. So this includes, painting jobs, light bulb fixes, all kinds of things. If I separate them out to look at demand work orders versus PM, you've got about an hour on the demand side. And if it's PM, things are taking about an hour and 20 minutes On the PM side, when I dug into this, I think it's more that people are batching things together. You don't just go and do one filter change at a time. You do a bunch. So you've got longer jobs, but they're usually covering more. On the demand side, I actually did a project related to this to dig deeper into light bulb changes and how long those were taking folks. And this was really interesting because I did this one talking with a set of administrators and executive directors and got their impressions. It was like 10, 15 minutes was the average that they were, assuming it would take. The actual data is closer to 25 to 30 minutes because of getting the part, traveling to where the light bulb needs to be changed. If there's a ladder that's required, getting the ladder, putting the ladder away, putting the old light bulb away. The time that these things takes, once you start to get into it, it really is interesting because it starts to give you a greater understanding of where time gets invested and where it goes. Another one that I think is interesting relative to productivity is the average days open for jobs. And there's lots of ways that we can look at this. We can look at it based on, resident impression, staff impression in terms of the work that they've requested. We can look at demand versus PM. But overall, 3.8 days is the average. And I connect this to productivity because the more productive I am, the more likely it is I can speed through and finish a job. When we broke this down with demand versus PM, PM is actually finished faster than demand work. I think that's because people are actually scheduling PM for when they can make it happen. So it's less likely that it sits open, that they get it done. I find that overall, if we're talking a resident service, you can have a work order for a resident sit open about maybe 3 days at the maximum before they start to get a little bit antsy and start making phone calls and checking in and sucking time away. Next stat, just to give you an idea here, percent of work that's completed on time. If you're not setting a service benchmark, it's another thing that we're really huge proponents of. Set a benchmark for when work should be finished by and figure out how often you hit it. The average we found, about 76% of work was being done on time, 78% for the demand side, 73% for PM. So some interesting stuff there. I think that with all of this, one of the biggest things that I hear out in the field, if you will, when it comes to productivity is the fear around Big Brother watching over things. If you start tracking time in your community, which I really encourage that you do because of all the great returns you get, improved productivity, lowered response time, et cetera, you do want to make sure that you're broaching it the right way with your staff. And I find talking about it not as Big Brother looking at things, but actually as a way to get recognition for the work that is being done and get more respect for the facility side can be really useful. The other piece is making sure you're capturing all the work. That's another challenge. We hear a lot of people report that, they forget to write things down. So making sure you've got a system in place to manage that. So next, use of contractors. So this is the idea of kind of what type of work are we contracting out? Are we monitoring what's contracted out? Is the percent on the rise? Is our cost justification for outsourcing? And to be clear, I'm not talking about outsourcing a full department here. That's a whole nother topic. I'm talking about, does it make sense for me to have someone on staff who can do my electrical or plumbing versus getting an external person? And this might equate to, are you single site, multi-site? How big are you? Can you use resources across multiple communities, things like that. But we wanted to look at, how prevalent that was. So there's our stats there. If you look at it, just about 70% are doing between 10 and 40% of their work. We find that huge factor on this is how big a community is. The larger they are, the more number of sites they have that are concentrated in an area. If it's a multi-site, the more they're able to have more experienced people in their internal teams to deliver that work. Biggest thing for me with this is really that we are starting to see an increase, but it's coming with a cost. So when we look at sites that contract out more work, we find that there's typically an increase in the response time. So the impact on outsourcing is you will wait longer to get things done. Really important to pay attention to that when it comes to if you've got unit turnovers and you've got simple things like painting units. Are those types of outsourcings delaying the availability of the unit? We had one group where we worked with them on tracking their unit turns, and what they discovered was that they were getting a great price on the unit turns because the facilities director was going with the lowest bid, but the projects were taking twice as long as a slightly more expensive bid. So they were having units that they could not occupy for an extra, in some cases, 6 weeks for a small savings. So you want to watch for that. Visibility into the work and quality can be an issue. We also find sometimes there's reports of resident satisfaction issues. They don't love having external folks all around, and it can lead to over-outsourcing. So this is another one where I had a group that I worked with where a new executive director came in, and they looked at essentially where the work was happening, what was being done. Didn't really see anything strange. Everything looked okay. And then HVAC contractor parked in their parking spot. They started watching that, and they noticed that the HVAC contractor's trucks were on site every day. Turned out that they had outsourced all of things like filter changes, really basic stuff, and were paying through the nose for it. So in their case, they were able to actually look creatively once they sat down and talked about, how best to manage this. And they started using, I think there it was their transportation driver to do some of the filter changes in that person's downtime. So you can get creative as well, looking at maybe not just outsourcing to an outside body, but other roles in your organization that you might have the opportunity to use, like a transportation driver. I've seen sites that have security help out with some of the basic PMs and documentation. You can get creative there as well. So internal staffing metrics. So this connects back to the idea of outsourcing and the productivity side. What we're looking at here is, what's the average number of staff that a community has? So I'm going to pull this up. Now, this was reporting, if we refer back to the original slide that I showed where I talked about the number of sites that are, sorry, not the size distribution of sites, how many were 0 to 100 units in terms of residents, that type of thing. This data is skewed towards larger sites. That is evidenced by this number here. I don't know of really very many sites that are between 0 and 100 units that have over 2 maintenance staff. Average might be 1 to 1.5, unless they're doing a lot of stuff internally or you have a really old building that you're trying to manage. So I think that, take this with a grain of salt on this side. I share this because I want to encourage discussion around this, but there are some factors to consider. I don't think that anyone can look at this and say, oh my gosh, I am overstaffed or I'm dramatically understaffed, because it's a nuanced picture. When we're thinking about this, I'm taking data from all kinds of organizations. You want to think about, are you a spread out campus with lots of, mileage that someone has to walk to get work done? Is your travel time going to be higher? Are you a multi-story with elevator delays? Worked with one group where maintenance staff were only allowed to use one elevator and housekeeping used it, so there was a huge problem in up and down time. Do you contract out a lot? Are you a higher end community that has a higher level of resident service? Some factors to think about here, but these can be general ideas, give you food for thought and think about why your levels might be where they are. So next, resident satisfaction surveys and training. So We, of course, are in a resident service business here. We're dealing with people's homes. So the idea of resident service and residents being our customer, our client, is supreme, I think. So we wanted to look at essentially how communities are measuring resident satisfaction. 72% are doing annual surveys. Only 4% are doing work order surveys. And this relates back to, maintenance, even housekeeping in some cases. About 10% are doing some form of outbound resident phone call to follow up with a work order. Lots of groups are getting resident committee feedback. What I found interesting with this was this historical focus on annual surveys. That's something we've seen for years. Big surveys are done maybe once a year, once or twice a year. And those are fantastic because they can really dig into things and give you some really detailed information. But we do see a trend, and we certainly advocate for this, towards more real-time surveys. The 14% that I'm talking about here reporting having an emergency survey, those are the people who are doing surveys directly connected to work orders and those who are calling right afterwards. We're seeing that really rise up, and we think that's an essential part of an effective resident service management piece. We want to get more real-time data on how they feel about what we're delivering on the facility side, because it's something that we can usually fix really easily. Did I not show up on time? Did we leave the unit messy afterwards? There's some really basic stuff that if we can identify sooner, we can really deal with those annual survey trends before they even hit us. We can see big jumps. We also are seeing a shift to more automated survey processes, people accepting email surveys. We see that more on the independent living side. And more usage of the data when it comes to staffing. We've seen more of that come out. So on the training side, we're seeing more and more a focus on this. We've seen lots of people talk about, Disney-like programs for high levels of service. I have calls regularly where people reference some kind of Disney training program they've been on, or they create their own, like a first impressions program. It's all about resident service, though. We're seeing that more and more. We're seeing people report back online training and experiences there being adopted more. In our survey data, only 9% of CCRCs or life plan communities reported having no training. There's a larger opportunity for other care levels. 27% of SNFs reported no resident service training, 36 and 33% of AL and IL organizations. So if you're in one of those not doing it yet type of bins, it can be a great opportunity to really deliver a different level of service. And it can be basic training. There's online stuff that you can get to take people through. So resident service and the evolution here. We're seeing a lot of changes coming out here. Lots of things where people are starting to offer different services. We hear lots more folks talking about Wi-Fi, more connectivity or faster speeds, people wanting to stay in touch with families for their video streaming, or just simple Netflix and things like that. We're seeing that even impact the skilled side as people start to want to make sure they've got internet maybe for guests or family members who are visiting. We see a huge surge in resident portals. Everything from basic ones that people build through their own SharePoint portal to commercial grade ones. But these are all tools to engage more with residents. I think that's going to be something that evolves over the next number of years. But we found about 50% of people said they were either actively using or reviewing one. Lots of streaming stuff. We see in-room touch screens coming out in some of the higher end sites so that residents can check on things, pull them up. We also have started to see an evolution on billings. So this is really addressing the idea of service creep. We've talked to folks more and more about the impact that free services have on the bottom line and the ability for the facilities team to deliver on their core objective, standard priority work orders, preventative maintenance, compliance, things like that. We've seen a spike in the type of additional work that's being asked for. I think I attribute that to the next generation of senior coming in, the next generation of adult children working with their parents, bringing them in. And what we're finding is a lot of organizations are starting to look at how they can bill for services. So if something goes beyond the scope of the normal maintenance service, could be putting together a bookshelf, changing light bulbs, things like that, we're starting to see more and more people add billing options for this. And we've seen, this data is about 6 months old right now, but the average amongst our client base for those tracking billings was $18 per resident unit per month in that case. So you can see, there's a revenue source there. If it's work you're already doing, it's also a way to push off some of that work, starting to bill for it. And in terms of how people are billing for it, we find lots of different rates that are out there, but I thought it would be good to share with you just some of the standards. Maintenance average is about $31 an hour. That's the average. No one's actually charging 31. They're doing it typically in, round numbers like 30, 35. Low of $15 and a high of 70. The 70 is, I think, one group, in a very urban area, expensive wages, things like that. Low end of $15, it's a loss leader. You're losing money at that point. Housekeeping, we see the average there being about $25, $12.50 at the low end, high end of $37.50. Most commonly, people are not billing to the minute. They're rounding either 15 minutes or 30 minutes. They're including things like travel time, sometimes billing for parts, but lots of opportunity there for organizations. Now, I think that one of the things that Lindsay and I were talking about before this was really the idea of the impact of resident portals and integrations. Lindsay, I think you had a group that had just done some work on kind of resident portals and work requests. Do you want to share some of that story?
Sure, yeah. We've seen an increase in tech-savvy seniors, which necessitated the look for an integration with a resident portal. And so we've been able to do that with one community, lots of communities, but this community in particular. And they saw some staggering results just from, having that integration with a resident portal. In the first 3 weeks, which I thought was crazy, they saw 20% of residents sign in and submit a work order. And then of those, 50% were submitting more than one work order. And they expected to see a cost savings of about $225 in time saved. So obviously, getting residents engaged is huge. Getting that efficiency gain as well is big. And then the cost savings at the end of that too, rolls it up nicely.
Mm-hmm. And I think for me, the big thing with it was the idea of they were saving time, which translates into dollars, but they were also delivering a better service, because what they reported was that the residents were actually able to see the status of the work and feel really taken care of, and it wasn't something where you had to go through 3 different people to check on things. We're starting to hear more and more demand for those types of things, and I think that that's a precursor of what's to come. If you're not seeing it now, the demands for technology, the resident engagement piece, I think we have to be prepared for it. It's not something that everyone needs today. It's not something that every resident, of course, is asking for. But I think the further we get into inviting, that next generation of senior into our communities, the more we're going to see an expectation of that rise. I'm excited about it because I think it's going to really change the way that we're able to interact with folks. And now, speaking of interacting with folks, communication. The idea of how are departments communicating? So with this, we wanted to look at, how often are teams meeting on the facilities side? We hear lots about people complaining, I think, across any industry and any level of employee about how much of a time suck meetings are, what's happening. So we wanted to get a feel for how often teams were meeting and what type of meetings they were having. So as you can see, 26% reported daily. I'm guessing those are like little 5-minute kind of stand-up meetings. 25% were once per week, 29% monthly. Not really sure about the 5% who don't know. That's a little weird. I think they'd know if they were in meetings or not, but maybe they just are not great meetings. So we've got, the types of meetings that are going on. And then we wanted to look at, related to the communication side, how often are we communicating or reporting data back to leadership? So is that something we're doing daily? Well, only 4% of people are doing that, which doesn't surprise me at all. I don't think daily reports up really make sense. 13% were doing it weekly. We see that as a great way for a maintenance person and administrator to stay in touch, just giving basic reports back. Monthly, quarterly, 30% and 20% respectively. Annually, 6%. If we're only reporting up how we're doing annually, then basically we're just doing a numbers game. We're not really looking at how we can use that data to improve if we're only looking at it once a year. So I categorize those folks as the same as the 14% where it's not being reported at all. So I'd say 20% of people aren't looking at data to actually improve how they're operating, which is a missed opportunity. Now, some of the things that folks talked about from a reporting perspective, what are they looking at? Response time analysis, really looking at, comparisons over years, looking at the compliance side with work audits, looking at special projects, reactive maintenance, looking at what's been done, not been done. We've done a lot of stuff around the idea of looking at how is it that we can best share data and make improvements from that. So relative to that, we broke it down into a number of categories. Lots of things people want to report on around staffing and productivity, comparisons and benchmarking. That's what drove us to create a whole benchmarking tool within our solutions so people can compare themselves against other senior living operators. Quality assurance and even mock surveys. We've seen a big need to start to drive that. Looking at inventory control, labor tracking, and then asset planning around the whole idea of capital planning, asset management, knowing what we have to replace when, that type of thing. Another big thing that we've really been trying to get our clients to adopt and we really advocate for is 15-minute stand-up meetings. This is something, if your organization isn't doing now, it's a great tool. Lindsay, do you have some tips for folks on kind of stand-up meetings and how they might be able to run those?
Sure, definitely. We've seen a lot of communities adopt this process. And essentially it's just that, that opportunity for the team to come together first thing in the morning, review team performance in real time. So they have the opportunity to celebrate the group success and highlight, individual team contributions. And it also allows everybody the opportunity to have communication, right, around identifying barriers and talking about what solutions there are, and getting buy-in on those. That way we can keep that open line of communication and make sure everybody's on the same page and headed towards the same goal.
Yeah, it's we've seen organizations that adopt that being ones who typically manage to identify problems earlier, solve them with less touches, and act as a more cohesive team, actually working together. If you're interested, we're happy to share some handouts we have on how to run 15-minute stand-up meetings. They can be great resources, just tips on things you might want to run. Another exercise I love is to actually get the executive director to write down their top 10 priorities, get maintenance to write down their top 10, and then match them up and see what's different and then talk about it. That can be something you do once a quarter. Nice alignment session to keep things going. So with that, that kind of draws us to a conclusion of the formal part of the presentation. So George, I'll pass it back to you with, I guess, about 10 minutes left, and to see if there's general questions. We're happy to answer anything that's out there.
Great. Thanks, Josh. And thanks, Lindsay. I think that was terrific. Want to start out with a couple of quick questions to kind of get things going here. Josh, do you have any recommendations on how to facilitate communication between the executive leadership and the operations staff? What are some best practices around that?
So I think it'll go back to that idea that I just gave on the priorities. So we find a lot of the time there's a lack of alignment between those that are managing the day-to-day activities and those that are leading more of the strategy side or the higher level components of the organization. So a simple activity of writing down what are the top 10 things relative to maintenance that the C-suite is concerned with. Could be the executive director, regional director, whoever it is. And then what are the top 10 things that the site level manager, the maintenance manager, maintenance supervisor are concerned with, and then draw a connection between them and identify what's missing on one person's list versus being on the others. I worked with one group where the executive director had a nursing background. They had documented it was chips in the porcelain on the sinks as a major issue, and it wasn't even on the maintenance person's radar. The executive director talks about that being a major infection control issue because it's impossible to clean in the cracks. It's a major issue. The maintenance hadn't even thought about it that way. So by aligning that, they understood where each person was coming from and were able to come up with a more common actionable list of priorities.
Oh, that's great. I think just to put it out to the audience again, if you do have any questions for Josh or for Lindsay, please go ahead and enter them in the lower right-hand side of your screen on GoToWebinar. Josh, I've got a question here from the audience regarding some operational differences on how you might look at the operations of a CCRC versus just a straight AL or IL community, in terms of solving benchmarking strategies.
Yeah, they are different, absolutely. Typically, a CCRC is going to, and these are generalities, so they don't apply across the board, but typically a CCRC is going to have a higher number of residents. They're going to have a higher level of resident service and typically higher staffing levels. So I find that if we're comparing a CCRC to an AL or IL, the first thing we have to do is adjust for a size difference. So we've done a lot of work on our end to set all of our benchmarks onto a per resident unit metric so that we can actually take an organization or site that's 400 units and compare them to something that's 75. So you have to adjust for size, number one. And then number two, you have to have some kind of an adjustment to look at what's the service level. So if I have an organization that has the full gamut, I would look at putting things into service level tiers so that we can look at a staffing level for an AL community that might deliver less in terms of housekeeping customization, let's say, versus a CCRC that allows for a lot of on-demand requests and be able to adjust that way. And then the next piece would be looking at the compliance side. As you move deeper into the care levels, so you go from independent living to assisted living to skilled nursing or memory care, there's going to be an increased emphasis on the compliance side because of the regulations. So depending on what you're comparing yourself against, you want to make sure that you're looking at the compliance bucket of work possibly separate from the day-to-day.
Great. I think that's a good answer. How do you talked in your presentation about I'm quoting it, over outsourcing. What data should an operator be looking at when making those decisions on outsourcing versus kind of relying too much on our outsourcing strategy?
I think you have to look at the cost. You have to look at the response time and the impacts. So I always look at things with a variety of lenses, if you will. So number one is the cost. What would the cost be to do this in-house? And it is not going to be possible to do for a standalone community some of the electrical, plumbing, and HVAC stuff. It's just not realistic for licenses and things like that to staff those folks. But if you're looking at outsourcing some of the more fundamental things that don't require a license, you've got to look at the cost. What are you going to be paying versus what it would cost in-house? And get creative when you're looking at that. Don't just think of, I have my maintenance person who can do this. I find successful organizations go beyond that and start to think of, well, who else could help with this type of a job? And that's where I was talking about, security people, if you've got them, transportation drivers, custodial folks. There are some things that you can, double up on from a staffing perspective to get those efficiencies. And then if you are big enough to bring things in-house, that's fantastic. But then you have to watch out for how you're distributing work, because you don't want to be paying 3 times the standard maintenance wage for someone to change a light bulb. You've got to get good at assigning the right level of activity and being able to consolidate jobs. And if you have a multi-site environment where sites are within a reasonable kind of radius, the idea of being able to batch jobs together and share them out to a corporate resource can also become a great piece to look at.
Right. Before we kind of wrap up here, we want to do a quick poll with our audience here, and I'm going to put it up on the screen. And while people are filling out the poll, Josh, talk to me a little bit more about productivity. We talked during the webinar about people needing, to get a lot done during the day and not being fully productive that 7 to 8 hours. What are some quick tips and kind of key takeaways that you can recommend for increasing productivity during the day to get the most out of the time they have at the community?
Thanks, George. That's a great question, George. So number one, track the time that people are working. Have them log how long they spend on work orders. That's going to have a direct impact to how much work gets delivered. If you keep score, you actually get a different result. Then you can, if you're keeping score, you can post those results. If you've got multiple people on the team, just put a scoreboard up showing how many productive hours each person had. You don't have to put their names on it. You don't need to call people out. People will know, though, where they sit. A bar graph showing who's where. That can really, give people a little bit of an eye-opener and awareness. So those are basic things. And then you get into the next level where we start to look for efficiencies on grouping jobs together. I see a ton of sites where they have this one-to-one relationship. I pick up one work order, I walk out, I do that job. Oh, I need a part, I walk back to the maintenance shop, I pick up that part, and I walk back out to the place I was going to do the job, and I do it, and then I walk back to the maintenance shop to get the next one. They're doing 4 trips for one job. If you batch work orders together by location, you can become much more efficient. Instead of this ping pong back and forth, you've got a nice route that you're taking. You can also batch jobs by type. So you can go through and say, hey, I've got all these painting touch-ups. I don't have to do them this week. Let's save them so that over the next 2 weeks, I batch them all together and I take 2 hours and walk around and just do painting touch-ups. That right there is a big time saver because of all the time that's spent prepping and then cleaning afterwards. And then the last one I would really advocate for is the idea of prioritization. Prioritize your jobs. Don't allow someone to say, hey, this needs to be done, and that means you drop everything and you go and do it. Give yourself a little bit of room to group things together. A true emergency, fire, flood, yeah, we're going to run and do that. But anything else, let it sit so that you can batch things together and actually look at them in a bigger sense and become more efficient. So those would be my tips.
Thanks, Josh. That's great. Well, I think that kind of wraps up our time here for the webinar today. I'd once again like to thank Josh and Lindsay for their time today. And thank you to all who have attended. And thank you to Dude Solutions for sponsoring this webinar. As we discussed earlier today, we will be sending out a copy of the webinar and slide deck to registered attendees, and that email will come from the team at Dude Solutions. And once again, I'm George Yednek with Senior Housing News. Thank you very much for your time today, and I'll look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thank you.